Okay. All right, now it is my privilege to bring to you Mr. Alex Lawson and his paper, The Nature of Perception.
Perception is a necessary faculty for human existence. And though we use it every day through our senses, do we really understand its nature or how it works? Our perceptions are what allow us to interact with the world around us. Although perception is generally used to describe the functionality of sight, in reality, perception is anything that is received through the senses. In other words, anything that we sense belongs to perception. Because perception is such an integral part of life, it is natural that the greatest thinkers of history have pondered it at length in order to discover its nature. However, due to the differing eras of the philosophers, as well as their differing viewpoints, the proposed natures of perception are exceedingly contrasting. Four of these magnificent scholars who have delved into the topic of perception are Immanuel Kant, G.W. Leibniz, David Hume, and René Descartes. Comparing the pondering of such regarded, learned men can only benefit one's own philosophy, and help to answer the question, what really is perception? Or rather, what is its correct explanation? While Hume and Descartes explain the nature of perception in a very secluded manner, that is, only concerning the person who senses and their immediate surroundings which they sense, Kant and Leibniz completely rewrite the universe to form their own theories. As such, it is best to first compare those two that are more complex, the notions of Kant and Leibniz. Immanuel Kant was a Parisian German philosopher who lived during the Age of Enlightenment, or rather, the mid to late 1700s. In the first part of his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, Kant asks the question, how is pure mathematics possible? Whilst undertaking this question, Kant finds it necessary to explain the nature of perception in order to explain how intellectual concepts like geometry can accurately apply to the physical world. In his vision of perception, the physical world does indeed exist, but we can know nothing, absolutely nothing, about it in itself. Essentially, it is our mind that paints the world, and that appearance is all we can know. In other words, it is the mind that creates the image of the world that we perceive. Additionally, it is important to note a term that Kant frequently uses, a priori. A concept or notion that is a priori is derived only from pure reason, and should thus contain no error. Things that are a priori can be accepted as universally true. In contrast to the theories of Kant, G.W. Leibniz's interpretation of perception completely disregards the idea of the physical world. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a prominent German philosopher of the latter 1600s and early 1700s, bases his perception on God. Leibniz claims that no physical world actually exists, and only God and substances, or rather souls, exist. Further, there is no direct connection between these substances, as each essentially expresses its own universe, which God emanates and controls. Thus, without further delay, let us delve into the minds of Kant and Leibniz. In his quest to discover whether metaphysics is a viable science, Kant proposes his own theory on the nature of perception. Put basically, Kant holds that when we perceive an object, we do not see the object in itself. Rather, we see a representation that our minds present to us. Our sense representation is not a representation of things in themselves, but of the way in which they appear to us. All of these external things exist in space, and space is nothing but the form of all external appearances. From this process alone, he says, we receive objects of sense. It is because of the connection between the mind and how we see physical reality that something like geometry can apply to the physical world as well as it does in the mind. In addition, this connection allows for geometry to be valid in that it is a priori. Sensibility, the form of which is the basis of geometry, is that upon which the possibility of external appearance depends. These appearances, then, never exceed the bounds which geometry sets. If this were not the case, and our senses present us objects as they are in themselves, then the opposite would be true. Without that connection between the mind and what we see, the space of the geometer would be considered a mere fiction. And geometry could no longer be considered universally true because it would no longer be a priori. Kant claims that the geometer could in no way produce objective truths, since we are unable to understand how physical objects would have to agree with an image of them which we make spontaneously and previous to our acquaintance with them. However, if indeed objects are presented to us only by our images, and those images are in fact only appearances created by our minds and and not things in themselves, then all external objects of our world of sense would have to agree with the principles of geometry. Put more simply, Kant's theory of perception is illustrated by the coherence of geometry. The reason that the intellectual principles of geometry do work in the real world is simply because both the idea of geometry and the reality we perceive originate in the same place, the mind. Similarly to Kant, Leibniz, on his path of metaphysical discovery, mused upon the nature of perception. In chapter 14 of his discourse on metaphysics, Leibniz finds it necessary to explain how substances depend on one another and how they interact. In this context, substances refers to us, or rather people. As a first principle, Leibniz suggests that all substances are not only created by God, but are preserved and maintained by him, continually, by a kind of emanation, just as we produce our thoughts. Further, God has his hand in all things, and affects those things as he sees good and fit. In addition, he sees everything from all points of view, and nothing escapes his gaze. Each view of the universe is a substance which expresses the universe in conformity with this view, should God see fit to render his thought actual and to produce this substance. Essentially, what Leibniz says is that God, according to his plan, creates substances or people who each have their own perspective on the universe. As such, each substance is entirely independent of all other substances or things, but none are independent of God. With this being the case, all our phenomena, that is, all things that can ever happen to us, are only consequences of our being. Even so, each substance's perceptions and expressions conform similarly to God's laws, and so there is consistency. It is because of this consistency that, for instance, several people who have agreed to meet in some place at some specified time can really do this if they desire. Thus, while each substance's perceptions may differ and may not be completely similar with other substances' perceptions, they are at least proportional. Naturally, God is the reason for this interconnection between substances, as they do not directly interact. As Leibniz says, God alone is the cause of this correspondence of their phenomena, and makes that which is particular to one of them public to all of them. Put more specifically, Leibniz states that no substance acts on another substance or is acted upon by another substance. All in all, each substance is separate and expresses its own perspective, its own universe that is maintained and emanated by God, and anything that happens to each substance is only the result of itself. Though both Kant and Leibniz lived during roughly the same era, their interpretations of perception are polar opposites. Kant relies on the mind as the source of perception, and Leibniz admits similarly. However, Kant proposes that the mind essentially paints the physical world. To Kant, the physical world is crucial, even though we can know nothing about it in itself. We perceive physical objects because those objects act on our senses, causing our minds to create representations or images that build the world around us. Oppositely, Leibniz disregards the thought of a corporeal world, suggesting that, instead, there is nothing physical. For Leibniz, the mind, again, is essential. The difference, though, is that the mind is all that exists. Rather than being placed in a physical world, we exist as nothing but substances in God, and everything we perceive is in God. Basically, the world is God. It only exists because God chooses to present it to us as he sees fit. Regardless of the differences in the physicality of the theories, both philosophers create worlds which are entirely subjective and unique to the individual. Kant's theory essentially says this repeatedly. Since the world is painted by our mind, and we can know nothing about the actual physical world, it follows that each individual will experience a different world. These specific representations that each individual perceives may not differ greatly, but they will indeed differ due to each individual's senses being unique to himself. In a similar way, Leibniz says that the universe each substance, or individual, sees is entirely specific to that substance. Though Leibniz's view makes each individual farther removed from the rest, it still admits the same, that what each one sees is specific to him. Put most briefly, the greatest difference between the views of Kant and Leibniz is that, for Kant, the mind is essentially God, as it presents to us our world. On the contrary, for Leibniz, God is God, since the world we see is completely dependent on him and on his grace. Though both theories strive to answer the question of perception, Kant and Leibniz propose wildly opposite views, as Kant affirms the existence of the physical world, and Leibniz states that no such thing exists. In order to distinguish which may be correct, it is best to examine other philosophical works to see if they conform, at least partially, to either side. Around the same time as Kant and Leibniz, two other philosophers, Hume and Descartes, derived their own explanations of perception. While these explanations did not involve restructuring the whole of existence, quite like the former two, the notions of Hume and Descartes deserve no less attention. David Hume was a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher who lived in the 1700s. In his theory, perceptions are twofold, as they are split between impressions and ideas. That which we gather from the senses are called impressions, and the images they form in our minds are called ideas. In most cases, ideas always follow and correspond with impressions. Unlike any of the other philosophers, René Descartes, a French philosopher and scientist of the early 1600s, uses science in order to explain his interpretation of perception. Since perception is reliant on the soul, but the soul receives these things from the senses which are present in the body. The soul is present in the brain, which is essentially the link between the body and the soul. Impressions are made on the external body, and those impressions travel through the nerves in the body until they reach the brain, and thus in the soul, where they are perceived. While Hume also operates partly on the basis of the physical and the metaphysical, he does so in a much more basic way, and his explanation lacks the overall depth of Descartes. To start his discourse, Hume makes a distinction within the concept of perception. Within the human mind, perceptions are split between two separate kinds, impressions and ideas. Impressions are those things, like sensations, that are more physical in nature and enter the mind with most force and violence. Ideas, on the other hand, are the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. Further, perceptions, or rather impressions and ideas, can be split between those that are complex and those that are simple. Simple impressions and ideas are those which are indivisible, while complex impressions and ideas are those which can be split into parts. In any event, the two faculties of perception, ideas and impressions, are reflections of one another, so that all the perceptions of the mind are double, and appear both as impressions and ideas. However, it is important to note that in most cases, one necessarily follows the other, or rather, ideas follow impressions. There is one exception which stems from impressions and ideas that are complex. Many of our complex ideas never had impressions that corresponded to them, and many of our complex impressions never are exactly copied ideas. To illustrate, Hume mentions the idea of New Jerusalem, or the kingdom of God when he returns to earth. Though we have never seen this grand city, we can imagine it with its gold-paved streets and luxurious design. Conversely, though one may have seen the city of Paris, it is impossible to form an idea that perfectly presents all its streets and houses in their real and just proportions. Regardless, simple and complex impressions and ideas are always correspondent and follow the aforementioned order of cause and effect. For it would be impossible to know or have the idea of the color red or the taste of a pineapple without first experiencing them through the senses. In conclusion, Hume's explanation of perception relies wholly on the relationship between impressions and ideas and the distinction between those that are simple and complex. While René Descartes is best known for his work in philosophy, he also penned many works about science. As a result of his more scientific nature, Descartes' interpretation of perception is much more grounded in physics and biology. In his fourth discourse in optics, Descartes explains how our senses in general perceive. However, in his first discourse in optics, Descartes explains sight. Put briefly, Descartes believes that light, which is essentially movement, is produced by luminous objects. This light travels from its source and is then reflected off various objects in various ways, depending on the object's properties. The light then travels to the eye, where it forms an image on the internal membrane of the eye. In addition to forming in the back of the eye, this image passes through into the brain. While this explanation of sight does rely in great part on the physical body, Descartes claims that it is the soul which has sensory awareness and not the body. This is evidenced by the fact that, when one is in deep thought or contemplation, his body can often miss events that happen around him which would normally give him sensation. The sensory awareness of the soul is due to its presence in the brain. Again, we observe injuries and diseases which attack the brain alone and impede all sense generally, even though the rest of the body continues to be animated. The way in which perceptions actually reach the soul is simple. Impressions are formed by external objects on the body. Those impressions then travel through the nerves to the brain and thus the soul. However, Descartes says, we must take care not to assume that in order to have sensory awareness, the soul must contemplate certain images transmitted by objects to the brain. Descartes claims that, in his day, philosophers held this theory to be the basis for perception. They also stipulated that images must resemble the objects they represent. This theory, he says, stems from the effects of pictures or paintings on the human senses. Pictures effectively cause our minds to think of the objects depicted, even though the picture itself is not the actual object. Thus, it seemed to them that the mind must be simulated to conceive the objects that affect our senses in the same way, that is, by little pictures formed in our head. Yet, the supposed effect can similarly be triggered by words or signs that, though they bear no resemblance to the objects they incite in us, do, in fact, cause images in our minds. Because of this, Descartes states that though our sensory perceptions do indeed incite images in our brains, their connection is not nearly as necessary as the philosophers would maintain. Additionally, these images do not have to be very similar to the actual object, and it is better that they are not. If an object we perceive were perfectly congruent with the object, with the images it provokes in us, then there would be no distinction between the thought and the actual object. It is enough that the image resembles the object in a few respects. Descartes demonstrates by mentioning engravings or paintings. When an artist creates a painting, especially one that is meant to portray a three-dimensional object or scene, he does so two-dimensionally. Moreover, in accordance with the rules of perspective, they often represent circles by ovals better than by other circles, squares by rhombuses better than by other squares, and similarly other shapes. Ironically, it is in the artist's best interest to make the painting less congruent with the actual thing in order to construct a better image. Thus, according to Descartes' theory, such a painting would incite an image in the eye, which would then be transferred to the brain and the soul. While Hume's and Descartes' interpretations are not completely opposite, like those of Kant and Leibniz, they do differ in that the ideas of Descartes are more complex and have more parts. Both authors make use of not only the physical, but also the metaphysical. Hume presents a perception that is double-sided, where one side, impressions, are based in the physical, as they originate from the senses. The unphysical side, ideas, stems from impressions and reflects them. Though not entirely converse, Descartes utilizes the physical and the unphysical in an alternate way. For Descartes, the soul, which is unphysical or metaphysical, is actually that in us which is capable of perception. The soul receives impressions from the physical body, and these impressions are transmitted throughout the nerves of the body until they reach the brain, where the soul is located. Yet, while both philosophers agree on the importance of impressions, Descartes, unlike Hume, disregards the concept of ideas. Although Descartes does not deny the existence of ideas or the reflections of impressions, he does not give them the same importance as Hume. Hume argued that, at least for simple ideas and impressions, ideas always follow impressions, and these ideas reflect and resemble the impressions from whence they came. Descartes invalidates this concept of ideas, saying that not only are they not necessary, but that they are better off if they do not closely resemble their impressions. Although Hume demonstrates some intriguing points, Descartes overall delves deeper in his analysis of perception and uses not only philosophy, but also science. Both Hume and Descartes affirm the existence of the physical world, thus suggesting that one does indeed exist. Additionally, both suggest that the physical and the metaphysical work together in harmony to produce perception. Although until this point Kant has only been compared to Leibniz and Hume to Descartes, mainly because of the scope of their interpretations, it is not unreasonable to take all four philosophers and pit them against one another. Of the four, Leibniz proposes the only theory which entirely does away with the physical world. His idea is that only God and substances exist, and that all substances are separated from each other. Each substance expresses a different world, which God presents to him. Yet, through God, these worlds do indeed have some interconnection. While the other three theories do similarly express the subjective tendency that each individual experiences his own perspective, their explanations rely on the physical world, at least in part. Kant muses that the physical does exist, but that we can know nothing about it in actuality. All we can know is what our mind shows us based on the appearances that our senses receive from physical objects. Hume and Descartes share this more physical view, but do not claim similarly that we can know nothing of the physical world in itself. For Hume, our senses present us with impressions of objects, and those impressions create ideas in our minds which reflect the impressions. In a similar way, Descartes claims that our senses receive impressions from physical objects. However, these impressions travel throughout the body into the brain and the soul, which is the site of perception. Descartes' concept does not include ideas to the same extent as Hume, as Descartes claims that ideas are not necessary for perception, and even that ideas should not greatly resemble their impressions at all. Regardless of the interpretation of perception, each view does provide a basis for consistency between the mind and the body, in some way. For Kant, this is simple, as both the observed physical world and our ideas originate in the same place, the mind. The same applies for Leibniz, since he teaches that our perceptions and our thoughts are essentially the same because there is no physical world. Though Hume's thoughts have less depth than his peers, he too accounts for consistency. For Hume, consistency stems from the fact that the unphysical side of perception, ideas, reflect the physical side of perception, impressions. Even Descartes' theories account for this consistency, yet his answers are harder to recognize. Descartes claims that the soul is that which actually perceives, and since it is the metaphysical element which actually perceives and also thinks, there too will be consistency. By considering each of the four views presented by Kant, Leibniz, Hume, and Descartes, it is possible to answer the question, what is the correct interpretation of perception? Of the four theories, only one states that the physical world does not exist. Though Leibniz suggests that people or substances exist only as thinking beings in God, Kant, Hume, and Descartes base their theories on the assumption that the physical world is real. While Kant, Hume, and Descartes all have views that are different, they each share some common elements which point to the truth. Each relies on the idea that physical things are taken in by the senses and judged by the mind. Because of Descartes' scientific nature, he not only explains this process philosophically, but also scientifically. By examining cases in the real world and applying those to his understanding of the physical and the metaphysical, Descartes crafts a theory which, in part, greatly resembles our current understanding of perception and sensation. Since Kant, Hume, and Descartes all agree on the existence of the physical world and the interplay between the physical and the metaphysical for perception, it would seem that that is the best train of thought. Finally, Descartes takes the notions of Kant and Hume and adds his understanding of physics and biology to explain the nature of perception.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. With regard to perception, it does seem that the question of how we know what we perceive is actually real. You know, if there is a physical world, how do we know that what we perceive is in fact an actual perception of it? Socrates has that very interesting little note where he just notes how different the things we perceive are to the things that we have in our mind, namely ideas. That ideas have no spatial relations, they are immaterial, they have no size, and yet they represent things that have spatial relation, materiality, and size to them. So obviously what goes from what we perceive in the world around us to what comes into our mind, they're different things, and yet we still hold that there's a resemblance there that is good enough that we say that we have an actual perception. And so the question that you identified is a good one. And oftentimes writers have looked to the issue of consistency as the basis for explaining whether or not perception is real. And I guess what I'm thinking of with consistency is just to say, all right, in each of these four authors, how do they establish that our perceptions will be consistent? And so I think it's Leibniz says that our perceptions are all consistent enough that we're all four of us decide to meet at a place tomorrow. Well, we can all do that. We all end up at the same place. Some sort of consistent world that we all experience together. And so can you just kind of break it down for us on how each of those four authors that you looked at would explain the basis for why we can hold that our perceptions are consistent?
Do you mean consistent between observers, or consistent between observing physically and what you end up with in your mind? Do you mean consistency within a person, or consistency between multiple observers?
Actually, what I was thinking of is that I think it's a sort of consistent manifold of experience where we have one perception of things that forms a consistent reality. You know, I look at you, I turn away, and I look back, and you're still there. All right? I have perceptions that form a consistent universe of experience. And at least I thought, as you were presenting the authors, that when you spoke of consistency, that was the sort of thing you were pointing towards. That consistency in perception means that we have a sort of consistent experience that we encounter. Now, having a consistent experience would also give the possibility of having consistency between individuals. So maybe we are talking about the same thing, with a sort of consistency of experience between individuals. So, yeah, you know, I guess it probably would be best to focus tonight on why each of these authors would say that the experience of perception between multiple individuals all ends up being the same.
There were a few that did directly deal with that. Some of them did not. Let's see. Leibniz did very much specifically address that in his, as for consistency between individuals. Leibniz was one who proposed, or was the one who did completely away with the idea of the physical world. And for him, what he actually says is that there really isn't consistency between the different observers, or substances as he calls them. They are proportional. They're not the same, but they are similar. And it is the connection that God forms between these substances that allows them to, or that example he gives of people being able to meet in the same place at the same time, because God makes what is particular to one of them public to all of them. So for Leibniz, that consistency between multiple observers is specifically because of the connection that God gives between the observers. For Kant, Kant didn't directly address that one either. I had originally thought that that kind of consistency would work for Kant simply because he believes in a physical world, and so since you have a physical world, you have multiple people in it. And you would have, I suppose, consistency in that the physical world would be the same, although what each person experiences will most likely not be entirely consistent because each person's senses are different. So while the physical world would be the same, the appearances that each person receives from their senses of that physical world would be different. The same would probably apply for Descartes and Hume. Neither of them directly addressed the idea of multiple observers either, but both of them also have that idea of a physical world. And so the consistency or similarity would be in the fact that the world is the same, but the discrepancy would be in the fact that each individual's senses are unique to that person.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think I'd like to next go on to just the notion that trying to give a basis for perception, if that necessitates the reality of a physical world. I mean, some people have pointed out that what we perceive of the physical world may be radically different from what the physical world actually is. Kind of classic example of this is color blindness, where some people see color in different ways, or even our perception of color, to think that when I perceive color, that really may be a phenomena that is unique to me, not in the object. And so the perception of color may indicate that our understanding of the real world may actually not be accurate. And so, and if you have a sort of skepticism towards our other experience as well, our experience of solidity or our experience of smell, all these simply may be our own version of seeing things in that way. If you're going to talk about the accuracy of perception, is that really meaningful if perception may be a different element than what the physical world actually is? I mean, how is it, when I say I have accurate perception, how important is it to be able to say the way I perceive things is the way they are in the physical world?
Well, it may not be satisfactory to many people to hear, but depending on the interpretation you can't actually say that what you see is anything that's super accurate. For Kant specifically, I mean, he says we can literally know nothing about the actual physical world in itself. All we know are those appearances that our mind shows to us. So, at least from Kant's view, there really is no idea of accuracy. It's simply what your senses give you of the physical world, because you can't actually know anything about it. Let's see, for Leibniz, I don't think Leibniz addresses that either specifically, except for his, since it is very much God-based, that would very much probably be reliant on God's grace. Kind of similarly to how Descartes would actually work. Not in his Optics, but if you go to his, Meditations on First Philosophy, I think, in his whole cogito ergo sum argument, one of his steps in that argument is about his mind and how it perceives things. And he trusts that what he sees or what he thinks is true simply because he was made by God. And if not, then he would have to be deceived by everything. But if not, then he was made by a good God who made him be able to perceive things truly. So for Descartes and Leibniz, that would be more reliant on the goodness of the God who created them. For Kant, unfortunately, there is really no idea of accuracy, and Hume doesn't really address something like that, I don't believe.
Well, are you satisfied with Kant's answer when Kant says that, the world of actual things we really have no access to? All that we know is our experience. All we know is our impressions of things. And he kind of makes this wall there that says you can't really know what the physical world is. And yet he says that because all of our experiences are created by our own intuition, that they're consistent. So we have a consistent experience. And so I can't know if my experience of red is real, as if that were based in some sort of physical reality. But yet, whenever I see red, It's consistent. And whenever I see a red apple, it always has a consistency about that experience. Are you satisfied with that explanation to say we have to get rid of this sort of notion that we're tied to a physical world for the validity of our experience and say, well, I know the consistency of my experience and that's really all I need?
No, I am not. Well, Kant's view of perception was certainly intriguing, and specifically because of that, because he very evidently states we can't know anything of the physical world in itself. No, I would say that I do not agree with his view, which is why I more sided with Descartes in the end. Specifically because Descartes uses more science in combination with his philosophy. Kant addresses that, uses philosophy, but yes, leads us to this somewhat depressing view of perception wherein we can't actually know anything about things in themselves. So no, I don't agree with that, and again, that's why I sided with Descartes, where he more, especially for sight, even though it is still going to be subjective because of our different senses, depending on the person, his is very much more, we can see things the way they are because light bounces off of them and into our eyes. So no, I'm not siding with Kant.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain in more detail why you find Descartes' position so persuasive?
Very much because of his combination of philosophy and science. I've always loved Descartes because of that, especially some of his that deal specifically with more complex physics questions. I find Descartes particularly persuasive because of, how he goes about things. In his, he listed out very scientifically different instances to show his principles, specifically like how he suggested that the soul is present in the brain and not throughout the rest of the body. He gave one or two instances of, okay, this happens. The example he gave was when one is deep in thought, how one can potentially miss sensations that would happen around him. Things like that, where he gives specific examples in the physical world, almost scientifically, in order to prove his thoughts. And then not only that, but he explains his philosophy with science. And it's really persuasive because even though he was back in the 1600s, he came fairly close to our current understanding of science. And so seeing his ability to understand science and apply it to his philosophy and actually get fairly close to our understanding today made his view much more persuasive to me.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Yes?
Okay. Really interesting paper and really logically and forward. It's good job.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a good question or not, but how important or how necessary do you think it is to understand or to study the interpretation of perception?
I would think it's very, although it doesn't specifically pertain to the nature of perception, is a good question. It's very important, and I would say that applies to pretty much anything in life. It's important which is why we take great books. We take great books to learn about the thoughts of these great philosophers of the past in order to see what they thought and then form our own philosophies based on that, based on all the things we've seen. So just like anything else in life, it's very important to study these different ideas of perception. And well, you could take a biology class and understand exactly physically how perception works, the rods and cones in your eyes and how they connect to the brain. The connection between the brain and the soul, or the physical body and the soul, is, well, outside of the scope of science. It's very hard to understand, not that we ever will be able to understand it. And so studying the idea of perception through the eyes of a philosopher would be very beneficial to try and gain a better understanding of how this physical perception actually works in congruence with that metaphysical aspect of you that is so important.
Thank you.
Yes, Josh?
I was just wondering, as a question of clarification, just to avoid any minor accidental equivocation, what would be your definition of the soul, and how does that compare to your definition of the mind? What's the difference between those two, or are you using them interchangeably?
Okay. I'll try to answer that one to the best of my ability, although it's not something specifically argued in these. In a lot of the reading I've done, especially in these, the mind is usually used fairly interchangeably with the soul. Although you would probably think of, if someone said the mind, you would think the brain. But in most of these philosophical kind of perception arguments I've read, you have the brain and you have the soul, and whenever someone says the mind, they are usually referring to the soul. It kind of depends, and it ends up being used very interchangeably, and it kind of gets wishy-washy there. The soul isn't specifically argued about as to what its nature is in this. That could be a whole other paper in itself. But specifically, what they do say in this is that the soul is that metaphysical aspect of a person. You have a person who's obviously physical, but on top of that, they have a metaphysical aspect. And obviously that's one that's much harder to understand, but it doesn't play any less of a role in that person. None of them address specifically what the soul is, but as much as they do, it is specifically just the metaphysical aspect of a person. There's really not much more explanation than that really given this, and again, that'd be a whole other paper in itself.
Thank you.
Yes, Hans?
Hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. First of all, that was a fantastic paper. I really loved just the level-headedness, the clearness of all your summaries, which is honestly the sort of thing I've been trying to look for recently. I've been trying to find definitions of these thinkers, what they think, basic summaries of thought. I'll consider adding yours to that list because I need material to help.
Appreciate it.
I have trouble keeping it all in mind. So summaries like this are really valuable. I wanted to ask a couple questions about the specifics of these people's thoughts, in part because I found them very confusing different times. So I'm interested to pick your brain about how you think they're laid. In the case of Kant, his worldview defines perception a certain way, as you're explaining, and then it distinguishes between how we perceive things and other thoughts, as far as I can tell. And yet at the same time, it says that our mind is the source of both. So my question is there really a difference between sense perception and thought? Or are they essentially the same, that we have this illusion that that sense perception is this thing happening through the organs of sense, and thought is this thing happening in our brains, but really it's all from the same place. They're on the same level. The mind is just actively doing both. And so we attribute them as being different, but they actually aren't. Because according to Kant, I don't see a distinction between them.
Yeah, and that's very much true. The way Kant says it, which is what accounts for his consistency between the physical and the metaphysical, is yes, exactly. For Kant, there's not so much of a distinction between, well, there kind of is, between the physical and the non-physical. Yes, both come directly from the mind, and it is the image of the physical world that we get that is painted by our minds. So while the physical does exist, yeah, exactly, there is not a huge distinction between the world of thought and the physical world from Kant's position.
Okay, thank you. And then another question on Leibniz this time, who is another one that I found so difficult to read. You're talking about how he views reality as, and this is how it was explained to me whenever I asked questions of more knowledgeable people, that reality is essentially reality as we perceive it is manifestations of God. It's not so much that we are interacting with different things as that we're interacting with God. How then, and those individual things also do not interact with each other actually. They're all separate, they're all individual, they're all unique. How then would he interpret something like an atom bomb, say, which is a single event that suddenly rewrites so much of what we see around us? It has the appearance of destroying and annihilating so many different people and places. Does that mean that the representation God has given us is kind of lying to us? That it appears things are interacting and changing each other, but they're actually not? Are our senses, in the way that God represents them, deceiving us as to actuality?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Where you have huge events like that would affect multiple people. It's kind of a weird one to explain, but the thing that most immediately comes to mind was when we were discussing this in class, and Mr. H used the example of, okay, if I were to pull a gun on, say, Breck right here, and I were to shoot him, he would die. He would die. From my perspective, he would die from his perspective. And though there is no direct connection between the perceptions of the substances, yes, what God chooses to present to me just so happens to be very similar to what God chooses to present to Breck. The ideas of Leibniz are much harder to explain and much harder to understand, simply because they are so God-reliant. They are so based on these metaphysical things that are incredibly hard or even impossible for human minds to understand. But that's the easiest way I can think of explaining it for Leibniz, is just that God chooses to present to us the world that he does according to his plan. And so however he decides to play out his plan in my perception is going to be very similar, if not the same, to what he chooses to play out in the plan for Breck's perception. And so take that and make it way bigger for all the people being affected by an atom bomb. And I think that's the best way to explain that.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, and briefly, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, you had a statement partway through your paper about Leibniz. He believes that the mind is all that exists, or something along those lines. That to me is confusing, and Leibniz and all these thinkers at times just seems all contradictory to me, and I'll be honest as I read them. But how, if the mind is all that exists, can you explain that in relationship to the concept of God presenting different things to us? Is God the mind at that point? Is that what you're saying Leibniz thinks? Or is it Leibniz saying he thinks? Is it saying that the perceptions that we're perceiving are actually an extension of the mind as they come from God? What does that actually mean?
Leibniz. Essentially, yes, in Leibniz's view, each person, it's weird, each person is kind of an extension of God. The way Leibniz explains it is God sees the universe from all perspectives, all points of view, and nothing escapes his gaze. And each of these perspectives can be a can be a substance if God so chooses to, put his thought actually, kind of. And so, very much then, each of these substances is a soul or a mind. Again, those can be kind of interchangeable. And anything that substance, soul, mind, experiences then is simply what God chooses to present to it. And so, there's not really a super clear distinction between if what the specific substance experiences is what is because of the substance or what is because of God. And it's not even that there has to be a distinction between that, because both are very much God. Substances, according to Leibniz, are somewhat extensions of God. So there's not actually a huge distinction there. They're very much mostly the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
The questions?
Yes, Wes?
Yeah, loved your paper and all of your previous GT5 presenters. Loved yours too. It all came to come. But you right now. So I'm going to jump and piggyback on Josh's question from a while ago. But I'm going to bring my own twist to it. So thinking of the terms soul, spirit, mind, and body, from just my observations of discussions in theology, philosophy, metaphysics, I seem to see that there's a spectrum of viewpoints. There are people that stress distinctions from each of those, and then there are people that stress commonalities between those. And within your paper, I think that you represented the stances of the philosophers quite well. But I'm curious about where would you stand on the terms soul, spirit, mind, and body? How would, what's your epistemology
Of what those mean and how they connect?
Yeah.
I actually did. I had a little bit of a discussion with this with one of my friends a bit back, and I kind of formed a theory on this. Mine would be very much congruent with Descartes as I kind of transitioned to at the end of the paper. The idea of Leibniz in discarding the physical world just seems very out there and not at all very reasonable. Right? I suppose I should address the terms you mentioned first. Soul, spirit, mind, body. Soul, spirit, and mind are pretty much the same things. They're often used very interchangeably to mean this one metaphysical thing, the one metaphysical part of a person that links with their physical part, the body. Because of this metaphysical nature of it and how it's so impossible to understand, I can't say specifically how the soul, spirit, mind connects to the body, but I would say it is something very similar to Descartes, wherein the brain is almost the intermediate between the soul and the body, where you have things that come from the body, perception, senses, that then come into the brain and are shared with the soul. My stance would be very much similar to Descartes. I don't know if I would deviate much from it. But when I did consider that a while back, way before I actually wrote this, my stance was already very much similar to Descartes. So I'd say it's something like that. Yeah, Josh?
So I was wondering, I guess, you're explaining, how convincing to you, like Descartes' kind of combination of science and philosophy is. And I was just wondering, the more we understand about the forces acting behind, things, something intangible like the mind, like neurotransmitter activity and hormones, all these things that kind of essentially control what you're thinking. Do you think the ideas represented in metaphysics become less necessary the more science you have to explain exactly what's going on?
It's a good question. It really relies, the answer to that question really relies on how much the brain and the soul influence each other. I did consider something like that when I originally made my theory on this. And I know there was one book that we've read in GBT that kind of addressed something like this. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I would say no, that these advances in science don't invalidate these more metaphysical incursions into how we work. Because as much as science can give us a very good understanding of how the physical side of it works, I don't believe science will ever be able to explain how these metaphysical, supernatural elements of us work. Science won't be able to explain how God works or what a soul is. So while science will definitely be able to give us a better understanding of that physical side, it will never invalidate this kind of thought, because this is the best way to pursue into that more metaphysical side of our nature.
Okay, and I guess if, we're talking about perception, and with our perceptions being of only things that, we can see and experience for the most part, what would lead us to even, think of, more conceptual things like God or a supernatural existence, when all we have are things primarily based out of experience or what we would understand as reality?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, you're just asking if things are so much based in the physical, what is it that leads us to think about these metaphysical things? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is that just a misunderstanding of the physical, or is it based out of a desire to find an answer to the why question, if maybe the why question shouldn't even be asked?
Yeah, no, definitely. As much as a lot of our nature and a lot of this and the idea of perception is based in the physical, that doesn't mean that the physical is all that you should ponder. Yes, a great part of our being human has to do with the fact that we are physical, we're here, we experience things. But that doesn't in any way kind of dilute the importance of physical things. Something like reason, logic, is not something that's physical. It's very much an imphysical or metaphysical idea that exists in your mind, and a lot of that is what leads to deep philosophical thought or the question of God. And even actually, this physical perception can very much lead to that metaphysical thought. Not that it's a misunderstanding of it, but very much along with the ideas of Christianity, looking at the beautiful nature around us, thinking, okay, this is physical, and it's designed physically, it's made of atoms, it's made of molecules, but where did those come from? How did they construct in this structured, organized way? And so actually, a lot of it has to do with observing the physical, and then yes, asking the question why, which will lead you to the metaphysical, which is pretty much a necessary question based on the existence of the physical.
Thank you.
The question? Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson.